Whether Boise State Public Radio brings a smile to your day, some inspiration, or a greater connection to Idaho and the world, we're proud to be here with you. Federal funding, about $1.60 per person annually, helps keep these trusted services strong and accessible to everyone in our community. Learn how you can safeguard local public media stations like ours by visiting protectmypublicmedia.org.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. Idaho is one of only 10 states that doesn't have a shield law. For clarity, a shield law basically allows journalists to protect the identity of a source. Idaho journalists, though, are trying to change that as the Idaho Press Club's Media Shield Law proposal, House Bill 158, advanced to the Idaho House, making it one step closer to becoming law. Joining us today to talk more about this issue is Melissa Davlin. She is the host of Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television. She is also the president of the Idaho Press Club. Melissa, good to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Gemma.
Okay, let's just start with the basics. I gave a really general idea of what a shield law is. Can you give us more clarification on what a shield law is?
Absolutely. A shield law establishes statutory protections for journalists from being compelled to identify confidential sources in court or disclose their unpublished material that they created or obtained over the course of their reporting. So that would be unpublished notes, recordings that didn't air, any communications between themselves and sources. As you said, Idaho is one of 10 states that does not have any form of this in law. We do have some really limited case law that is applied unevenly, and that has helped a few cases. But we brought this year specifically because in my role with the Idaho Press Club, have seen more and more journalists and newsrooms approach us for help quashing subpoenas that in other states would be protected by these shield laws and protecting their sources in turn.
So I want to go back to what you said about the fact that there is some case law here in Idaho, Melissa. Talk to us about this because, as you said, it's really narrow in scope. So can you explain what that means?
In Idaho, there are a few cases that have come up and made their way to the state Supreme Court over the past several decades. And one of them, the most recent one, basically says that if an attorney can get information elsewhere, they can't subpoena the journalist for it. There have been other cases that have said that the reporter had no privilege at all. Those were cases in which the reporter himself was a defendant. And so it hasn't been a huge issue, like I said, because not many newsrooms were receiving subpoenas until the last couple of years, I would say. I have seen more requests in my press club capacity from journalists in the last year than I have in all of my years with the press club combined prior to this. It really is a growing problem. And so case law is not enough anymore.
So I want to talk about the bill itself, House Bill 158, because Melissa, let's start with the fact that you drafted this, but who sponsored the bill?
Representatives Barbara Ehart and Marco Erickson, both of them from Idaho Falls, offered to work with us on this after one of their local journalists, Nate Sunderland from East Idaho News, had to testify in court in December after his attorneys were able to narrow the scope of a subpoena but not quash it entirely. So Representatives Ehart and Erickson offered to sponsor legislation, and then I went ahead and, after doing a lot of research, drafted one based on shield laws in Alabama and Kentucky.
Okay, and I want to talk a little bit more about that because you, in this bill, talk about how you drafted and defined journalists and journalism.
Oh, I would love to talk about that because we specifically don't actually define what a journalist is. Instead, we focus more on news gathering and journalistic activity. And there are a few reasons that we do that. I looked at several other states. I mean, like I said, there are 40 examples, and I looked at a few dozen of them. And there are some states that define what a journalist is in very, very strict terms. It wouldn't offer protections to people like independent journalists or freelancers or part-timers. We instead chose to extend protections on the news gathering side. So as long as somebody is participating in news gathering and journalistic activity, and they're connected to a newsroom, whether that's a digital news site or a legacy newsroom, then they would be protected by this as long as they're participating in that journalistic activity. So the medium matters less than the practice of gathering information and disseminating it for the public. And that's the reasons for that are twofold. Like I said, we don't want to box ourselves into a corner and end up not protecting non-traditional journalists who maybe work for a community radio station or have an online only news outlet. We also don't know what mediums might exist in 5 or 10 or 20 years, and we don't want to box ourselves in. This would not cover people, however, who call themselves journalists but participate in behavior that would not be considered journalism. So that might look like protesting and live streaming a protest in which they're participating, or creating provocative videos and doing provocative behavior. Those actions are covered elsewhere in the First Amendment, but they're not the purview of this legislation.
I think this is a really important point to make, Melissa, because the media landscape is changing. And I mean, you mentioned legacy journalists. Well, there is also a new type of journalist, right? As you said, where their medium, their platform are things like TikTok, YouTube, Substack. But what they are doing is gathering information and doing the work of journalism. So was that also important in not defining what
Yes.
journalists look like?
Absolutely. Substack is a great example. There are a number of journalists who I subscribe to on Substack specifically, who used to be affiliated with either CNN or the Washington Post, who have
Hmm.
since gone independent. A few years ago, I wouldn't have dreamed that that would be a
Right.
primary news source or a source of analysis for me. And now it's pretty common. 15 years ago, the idea of a online only journalism outlet was also pretty new. We still had so much more print and broadcast and radio, and now the majority of new journalism outfits are online only. So we don't know what the medium is going to look like in 5 or 10 or 20 years. But the practice of journalism has remained the same and will continue to remain the same, and that's what we're interested in. We also got some questions over the course of talking to lawmakers about this, whether this would cover some, you know, frankly, more partisan sites? And the answer is yes, as long as they're engaging in journalistic activity. And remember, this is about the sources, and there are sources in places like
Hmm.
Idaho who might feel more comfortable talking to somebody affiliated with a more conservative digital news site than maybe a legacy news outfit. And again, it's about the journalism and getting information out to people. And so that source should be protected, just like a source who is comfortable talking to legacy media.
Because I would think, Melissa, that a shield law is not just important, but necessary in regards to protecting a source. We have whistleblowers because they have been protected.
Exactly. You and I both know it. That so much of what we do is dependent on people coming to us with tips. We
Hmm.
we go out and we seek information on our own, but sometimes we might not know that something is happening unless somebody gives us a heads up. And that might look like somebody giving us an internal memo that would be public record, but we don't know to look for it, and saying, "Hey, you didn't get this from me, but you should know this is going on." Or somebody saying, "Hey, I want to talk to you on background about this." Or somebody who is talking to us
Hmm.
on the record, but says, "Hey, can we go off the record for a second?" And if I, take notes and make a note in my notes that says this is off the record for my own information, right now there's no protection in Idaho that would stop that from being revealed in court. And we want to make sure that our sources are comfortable talking to us and are protected from anyone who might be seeking out that information. We got this bill out of the House committee And it's headed to the full House. And we had three journalists from across Idaho who came to testify. And one of them had an example of how a subpoena could be used to harass sources who talk to journalists. It was a really chilling story, and thankfully he was able to get this subpoena squashed. But this was a journalist who did an investigative report that revealed the identity of somebody who was leaving and distributing racist propaganda in Sandpoint and saying some really horrible things about how Jews and people of color needed to be exterminated or deported from the country. I mean, just some of the most vile stuff. The investigative report identified this man by name, and that in turn caused a campaign of harassment against the newspaper and the journalist himself. It lasted several years. This man was also involved in other activities that landed him in court, and he chose to represent himself. And in the course of his defense, issued a subpoena to this journalist and the newspaper, wanting all of his unpublished notes. That would have included the contact information for the sources who talked to him, and it could have resulted in those sources being targeted by this man's, vile racist campaign of hate. So he was able to get that subpoena quashed, but this is a perfect example of why we need these protections for our sources.
And one of the things that struck me, Melissa, about this public testimony, and you are speaking about the co-owner and publisher of the Sandpoint Reader, and in his public testimony, I mean, he said, first off, this is a small newspaper, right? I mean, it's not like they have a huge budget to be able to hire an attorney, to be able to do what it would take to quash this subpoena. He was lucky enough that there was an attorney that took this case pro bono. So
Right.
again, how important is it that just the general public, understands the necessity for a shield law?
Yeah, I think local news coverage is one of those things that you take for granted, and you don't know what you got till it's gone. And
Hmm.
this, in the case of East Idaho News, of Boise Dev, of the Sandpoint Reader, fighting those subpoenas cost a lot of time. In the case of the Southern Idaho outlets, cost a lot of money, and it it's not that far fetched to see a few more of these cases, maybe putting a couple of these outlets under, especially in a time where small journalism outfits have fewer resources than ever before. The Sandpoint Reader has three full-time employees, including Ben Olson, and so this is something where we can a lot of times judges do rule in our favor and agree that First Amendment protections would warrant quashing these subpoenas. But this legislation, if this were to go into law, would help stop that process on the front end before newsrooms have to spend thousands and thousands of dollars to get to the same result. Um, Best case scenario right now, we hire a lawyer and it costs a ton of time and money, and they quash the subpoena. Worst case scenario, we lose and we still have to turn over our notes.
So, Melissa, I know that you thought this would be an uphill battle to get this process going, to see what were to happen. We should note that there was a public hearing Wednesday, as we mentioned. No one spoke in opposition of this bill, and in fact, not only is it heading to the House for consideration, tell us about the fact that it got what do they call it? They're saying that it should pass. The sponsors of this bill.
Yeah. It is going to the floor with what's called a due pass recommendation. So this committee, without a single no vote, decided to send this on to the full House, recommending that their colleagues vote for it as well. I, you know me, I'm a cautious woman. I don't take anything for granted, and so we're going to keep working like this isn't a sure bet, and it would still have to make it through a Senate committee and the full Senate before heading to the governor's desk. I am crossing my fingers. Like I never take it for granted, but we're also hoping to show that we're listening to concerns, we're answering lawmakers' questions, we're actively meeting with them still, and we hope to show that this is good for communities and sources, just like it's good for the journalists.
Before I let you go, tell us where exactly what happens next.
What happens now is it will sit on what's called the House third reading calendar, and they will vote on it. If it does pass with a simple majority, it will go over to the Senate and start the process over again there. So it will go through a Senate committee, have a public hearing there, and if it does pass, it would have to go through the Senate, get a simple majority in the Senate, and then it would have to be signed by the governor. Crossing my fingers.
Well, Melissa, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us about this. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Gemma.
We've been talking with Melissa Davlin. She's the president of the Idaho Press Club, discussing House Bill 158, which, if passed, would put a shield law in place here in Idaho. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
Each morning, it's a new opportunity, a chance to start fresh. Up First from NPR makes each morning an opportunity to learn and to understand. Choose to join the world every morning with Up First, a podcast that hands you everything going on across the globe and down the street, all in 15 minutes or less. Start your day informed and anew with Up First by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts.